Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I'm going to be reviewing Loki Season 2, which just finished up recently on Disney+. Now, with regard to Loki Season 1, I was a fan of the series. When it initially started, there was a lot of those questions, and you could actually see my review of the first season, as well as just the first episode in the cards in the top right corner. But when it first started, I was a little bit kind of wondering. I liked the style, I liked a lot of what they were going for, but over the course of the season, I went from being a little skeptical of the premise and a lot of the concepts introduced in that pilot to eventually thinking the show was really good. And contrary to what a lot of people said about how Loki was destroying the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which basically some channels will say with regard to literally anything Marvel does these days, the fact of the matter is that Loki Season 1 ended up being the best thing that was coming out of Marvel at that time. Now, with that being said, going into Loki Season 2, I was, naturally having some expectations because the first season was good. As a result, I hoped that this would end up being just as good, if not better. And I actually watched not only Loki Season 2 episode by episode as it came out, and I reviewed some of those episodes with World of Geekdom that you could see on his channel, but additionally, I actually went back and rewatched Seasons 1 and 2 back to back, just so I could get the full picture of the quality and the story that was being told. And honestly, not just with my first viewing, but also the rewatch, in my opinion, Loki Season 2 is by far the better season out of the two. Hey, I just made a pun. Isn't that punny? But with that being said, guys, I'm going to break down exactly why that's the case, getting into the pros, the cons, and that much more. But before I begin, if you're new here, consider subscribing and enabling all notifications. That way you can stay up to date with all my future videos. Share your own thoughts in the comments, leave a like, share this video out, and stay the entire time, because all of that's going to help this channel be more promoted for more people to lay their eyes on it and see the glorious purpose of me making videos online on YouTube for now. But with that being said, guys, let's get into the review. And the first thing I definitely want to talk about is in regard to the writing, direction, and cinematography from Season 1. Because overall, in my opinion, I would have to say that based upon everything I've seen from 1 to 2, everything was just handled better in this season in terms of the writing. Whether it be the different concepts that were introduced along the way, which I'll dive more into as the story goes on and as this review goes on, as of course I become the god of reviews. The writing was better, the direction was definitely better, and so too is the cinematography. Season 1 had some really good cinematography and visuals along the way, but Season 2 blew them away by far with the special effects, with the different visual spectacles we saw on display, especially with the series finale, as far as we know thus far. And, of course, the overall show handling was just done significantly better. I would have to say that, going back and rewatching the first season again, there were definitely some things that kind of stuck out to me as Marvelisms, with a kind of dumb humor at points, like, for example, in the first episode where Loki's trying to use his powers, he just so happens to get naked in one scene because, they like to do that and everything. And then, of course, there's a lot of things that were a little bit more of the time with Marvel, which you could see has been slightly changing in some ways since that happened. But overall, I think the show was just handled a lot better, and you could tell that they really thought everything out in terms of the story going on, not only with regard to each of the individual characters, but also in terms of the concepts, the overall plot, and narrative, because everything picks up exactly where Season 1 concluded. But the directions that they take everything in go far more to, I guess you could say, the extreme in terms of utilizing the concepts of time travel and different theories in there. For example, we have causality loops, bootstrap paradoxes, different theories of Einstein. There's even the whole kind of concept of the causality loop bootstrap paradox, in which somebody brings the idea of the theory of relativity to Einstein, and then he publishes it, and basically it's like, where does that information come from? They have loops upon loops upon loops in this show, and it definitely reminds me a lot of something like Dark on Netflix, which definitely seems like they took inspiration from that. Not just that, but we also have things like Groundhog Day, Back to the Future, and of course, the Matrix movies, which you wouldn't have thought would have been a big influence here, but with regard to things with Kang, especially in the last season, we had that basically architect scene from Matrix Reloaded with Kang and Loki, and then even beyond that, they take that significantly further in this season, and not just that, but we also have different inspirations from the MCU and also the Marvel Comics. Like, of course, as everyone's pointing out, including the people who've probably never actually read the comics, Loki becoming the god of stories in a sense, which I'll delve more into Loki and everything with regard to that. But in terms of the overall concepts, again, that is probably my favorite thing in this show because I'm a huge time travel story fan. I've seen so many of them, whether it be Dark, as I mentioned before, is one of my favorite shows of all time, something that I'd like to talk about in its own dedicated video at some point, and I recommend to anyone who likes this show, and everything, when you're going throughout the course of the season, you can't really judge it early on until you've seen the entire thing, because so much that is being set up throughout the course of the series is paying off in this season, especially by the final episode. Some things maybe you could say were left open. I'll definitely get a little bit into that as well. But with regard to the concepts, they handled them excellently and way better than you would expect in something, especially this late phase in the MCU, which really, in terms of the overall quality, I think that it really goes to show you that when you have something handled competently by talented writers and staff and actors and everyone who goes into production, that you can still make something great in the MCU, which is what they ended up doing with this show and with this season. And on that topic, one of the things that tends to be the biggest detractors overall in terms of Marvel, especially now, is that oftentimes it's really tonally inconsistent, or the humor is just so dumb that it just makes you cringe and roll your eyes and just say, why are they ruining high quality content by putting in really dumb humor? And for the most part, this season doesn't really have that. The comedy is generally organic, the pacing is generally well handled, with some exceptions here and there that I will bring up as the review goes on. There are a couple scenes, like for example, let's say the hot chocolate scene with Victor Timely that, went on for a while, that didn't really have any logical reasoning behind why that scene was even in the season, I guess, other than Victor Timely likes hot chocolate. But other than that, most of the jokes, I would say, land and aren't too distracting from the overall plot, the themes, and the tone of what's going on. Now, overall, in terms of the performances, I got to give it up, of course, to Tom Hiddleston as Loki. This is definitely his best performance in the MCU thus far, and his character has come so far in terms of his overall character development and the plot and the narrative. We start out with Loki taking place like immediately after the events of Avengers 1. And thus, as a result, he didn't have the character development from the Dark World, from Thor 3, and from Infinity War. Instead, he watched those things take place on a screen in front of him in the first season. But by the end of this show, he has changed so significantly in so many ways that he feels like a very different character. This Loki right here has gone through so many struggles, so many battles, and not just that, but in turn has become incredibly wise and powerful by the end of the series, especially come the season finale. Loki spends literal centuries learning about time, learning about every single thing that he could possibly do to make events go in a positive direction, especially after season 1, when they killed He Who Remains, the Kang variant who won the multiversal war. Sylvie did that, of course. I'll bring her up shortly. And the fact of the matter is that they kind of had to take over in the season after him. However, everything kept going wrong. The split in the timelines, where everyone learned that they were all variants, and so as a result, they stopped pruning them, and they started to go exponentially in terms of their overall multiplication, where it was expanding at an infinite rate, so they, in fact, had the entire multiversal loom, this kind of concept and plot element that we have in the series, which is on the verge of being destroyed because it is basically able to harness the raw time energy in order to create one timeline and then a multitude until it can't take anymore. And so Loki eventually goes through this entire cycle throughout this season, especially where he goes from being the developed Loki at the end of the last season to essentially learning what kind of god he truly wants to be, what kind of throne he truly wants to have, and eventually, in the most heroic way that you can have it, gaining that throne through the act of self-sacrifice, an idea thousands of years old, and naturally being able to become the god that nobody ever expected this character to be in the MCU, going from a really selfish being to one who's literally giving his eternity to making sure that everyone will still be alive and thriving. So great performance by Tom Hiddleston, only gets better and better as the show goes on, and his portrayal and of course everything with regard to that is handled excellently in this season. And he goes from the first season where he's kind of pining after Sylvie for a lot of the show to eventually becoming far more of his own fleshed out character, where sure, he does go through some ups and downs in this season. Not everything is necessarily perfect, I guess you could say, but overall handled excellently in that regard. And a lot of it does come down to the relationship and dynamic between him and Sylvie throughout the course of this, of course played by Sophia DiMartino. And the fact of the matter is, with regard to her character in this season, she's also going through a very different sort of arc, I suppose you could say, where she's kind of trying to live a life now that she's essentially given people free will, allowing for the splits in timelines, and she tries to go and live one. And, you know, some of it is a little bit strange along the way beyond that of the MCU. You know, one of the cons I have to bring up this show is placed a big way in terms of her in what we see, where she actually goes to McDonald's and starts to work there, and this is like the perfect place for her. And it really is some in-your-face blatant product placement that they have here that makes you wonder just how much McDonald's had to pay them, or at least, you know, just what kind of a crazy lucrative deal they did, where it kind of feels like what we saw in Man of Steel with IHOP and, you know, Power Rangers with what was a Krispy Kreme and, you know, things like that, where it was a little ridiculous. But with that being said, you kind of have this struggle and dynamic where Sylvie is still largely in the same mindset that she was in the last season. She still is angry at the TVA for essentially taking away her life and, you know, trying to kill her as a child, and not even trying to kill her, but prune her, erasing her from existence. And then, of course, we also have not just that, but additionally, you know, the struggle between her and Loki, which I do kind of wish they actually continued the romance plot between the two, even though it was weird in the first season for them to basically fall in love with themselves from other worlds. I guess it shows how big of a narcissist Loki can really be. In this season, there might be like little hints or tinges of it, but there's barely anything there with regard to the romance here, which, you know, a lot of things, it seems like the writers of this show in this season kind of took elements from last season, removed other ones that are a little bit too blatant and in your face, and, you know, kind of said what works and what doesn't, and did their best to improve in this season. And this is one of the things I kind of wish that they had played up a little bit more again, especially come the ending when, you know, I guess that maybe that's part of why they didn't, because, you know, it would be a sort of unrequited one in a sense. But at the end of the day, I kind of wish that they did more, and that she actually did have more of a wrapped up conclusive ending in the show. But I feel like with a lot of the characters, any non-conclusive endings we've gotten is something that will be paid off later on. Like, for example, with regard to Renslayer, who I think also did a really good job in this season in terms of not only the performance, but making her a very unlikable character. She's not exactly as interesting or as compelling as like Kang, for example, but I think that overall she kind of served as like this lower level boss that, you know, is the on-screen boss, kind of like the Sauron to Sauron in Lord of the Rings, for example, or, you know, just one of the kind of character, the villain that people interact with the most. And I also think that in terms of her, we do end up seeing, you know, her clashing against some of the other villains of this season, where they have different ideas of how they want to maintain the sacred timeline and how they want to keep everything in order, which eventually leads to one of the most gruesome scenes in the entire MCU, where they don't actually show it on screen, but but they introduce this kind of weapon in a sort, this punishing mechanism, I guess you could say, or execution means, where they have like a force field box that shrinks on whoever the target is and crushes them to death, which is pretty messed up and also pretty metal at the same time. And Renslayer pulls a pretty metal move when she kills a whole group of people at one time doing this. You actually hear like the sound effects of like the explosion of the blood and the bones cracking and stuff, which is pretty crazy, but they didn't show it. But it's one of the things kind of like with her at the very end where it's inconclusive, but multiple times in the show, they do a really interesting kind of direction style where they just show the reactions of the characters. Like, for example, at the end of episode 4 in the massive cliffhanger we get, where we just see the expression of Loki and the others on display when the loom seemingly explodes. We get to find out more of what that actually is later on. And so you can definitely tell that the direction was handled better, because a lot of times the implication is far more impressive than showing us something incredibly graphic on screen. I mean, tons of horror is based on that, right? Especially the classic ones. We also get Mobius, played by Owen Wilson. Wow. And essentially, he did a great job in this season as well. We get more insight into him as a person, the fact that he is willing to not only sacrifice his existence to help Loki, when at the start of the series, you know, he was basically like at points ready to prune the guy, and then in the season 2 he was instead, you know, doing everything he could to help and support him. But Mobius, in terms of this season overall, you know, he found out he was a variant, but he never even attempted to go and see what he was missing because he didn't want to know. He was afraid to know, and rather he wanted to stick to his mission and his goal at the TVA. And we get some insight into how, you know, he used to believe the ends justify the means in this series. And again, he had a lot of great character development throughout the course of it too, to where by the end, he's given what seems like a kind of satisfying ending, where I assumed what was going to happen is that he was going to return to the life that he had basically around the moment when he was first taken out of the original timeline and lived there. Either that, or he was just going to kind of observe it, see it, and then return in the future. But they again leave things open with him to where he definitely could come back and make appearances in movies. And, you know, all the characters in the show, for the most part, you would be interested in seeing making a return. And that's especially the case with my favorite character of the season, especially the newest character who was introduced, which is OB, or Boris, who is played by Ke Huy Quan, who of course was the same actor who played Short Round in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, as well as Data in The Goonies, which is probably my favorite role of his, actually, now that I think about it. And he was also in Everything Everywhere All at Once. Although, in terms of everything he did in this season, I think he was a really joyous, welcome addition, very entertaining, really sort of, in many ways, you know, the character who was like Geordie LaForge from Star Trek The Next Generation, where he would give a lot of exposition and explain everything that was going to happen. He even essentially was an engineer and an author that they play up in this. But not just that, but he kind of goes and explains something really in depth, and then he says something like, it's like too much air being released from a balloon, or, you know, the rings need to be bigger, and things like that, because a snake trying to eat its own tail, which, funny enough, is where his name Ouroboros comes from, the initial symbol of infinity, the snake or the dragon eating its own tail, and what comes first, and eventually everything along those lines. So I thought that he did an amazing job in this season, and this is definitely one of my favorite roles of his ever, and, you know, makes me happy that he returned to acting a number of years ago, because he definitely puts on a great performance here and makes every scene he's in better because of it. And of course, Jonathan Majors, playing multiple variants of Kang in this season, in this series, and really the entire MCU thus far, does an excellent job, especially in this season, where he not only plays He Who Remains, but also Victor Timely. And there's the whole question of whether or not Timely is actually going to become He Who Remains, the Kang variant that won the Multiversal War. In some ways, it seems like that might be the implication, but in other ways, it is kind of left open to the eye and the interpretation of the viewer. And overall, he does a really great way of separating and differentiating himself from the other Kangs, where he has the stutter, where he has, you know, his interesting way of speaking from the late 19th century, history of the United States. And not just that, but, him being that old-timey inventor from around the time of Edison and Nikola Tesla and everything. And, basically how he brings that kind of charm to the story and to the series. And basically, he is a king that tries to help, kind of like a Thanos that tries to help at the end of Infinity Gauntlet. In some ways, they're having that kind of dynamic here that they didn't really have in the MCU up until this point. And he does an awesome job here, not only playing, the essential kind of clueless scientist type of character who is fish out of water being brought along with us, but is also really brilliant and tries his best to help. And then at the same time, the He Who Remains variant, who also, is the arrogant one who knows all, sees all, and lays the groundwork for everything. He's basically like the architect and maybe in a sense also the Oracle, at the same time the Matrix. And it's always a question of, is everything he's doing? By the end of the season, you see that almost everything is, but then it still leaves the question open of, does he still exist after this? Was he erased? Was he killed? Or is he going to return? Is the loop infinite? Are him and Loki in a kind of dual kind of loop where Loki originally maintained the MCU because he exists outside time, and then Kang, this version, won the war and then maintained it? Things are left open, especially with the ending with Renslayer and whether or not she's going to bring it in. Does he have more contingencies? These are all great ways that they set up Kang, despite being a human being, to being a even greater threat than Thanos, because whereas maybe you can kill one Kang, there are always a number of different ones. And plus, this Kang is basically like Loki come the end of the season, where Loki gets the power to essentially slip through time and go back to points and change the narrative, change the story, and make things go the way that he wants. Except this one has done it a countless number of times to where maybe he already anticipated all this too, and he's still going to be the one that comes out in the end. So it's whether or not the idea is, do they truly break the loop at the end, or is that a part of an even greater loop? Like how many fans for years speculated about Matrix and Zion, and even if the quote-unquote real world was like another Matrix in the Matrix series, up until, of course, the fourth one that ruined everything. But with that being said, Jonathan Majors does an awesome job, and I really hope they keep him on for the rest of the MCU. I mean, looking at all the crazy stuff that they let other actors and other franchises like DC, for example, and The Flash, get away with things and keep bringing them back, why wouldn't you bring back Jonathan Majors for something that he hasn't even been convicted of at the end of the day? But that's a story for another time. I don't want to see him replaced by like Will Smith, or it would kind of be funny, I guess, if they replaced him with Terrence Howard, considering the fact that they replaced him with Don Cheadle and then probably replace Terrence Howard as Kang with Don Cheadle again, because I guess they, I don't know, want to save more money or whatever you said. Now, in terms of the tone, this was way more tonally consistent and better handled than the vast majority of stuff in the MCU, not just right now, but for a lot of its runtime, because so often in the MCU, they ruin it with like ridiculous comedy when they're trying to have a serious moment. They're telling a really interesting backstory like in Shang-Chi, and then it's like, by the way, do you want chicken or fish? Oh, we only have chicken, ha ha ha, this isn't funny. Things like that just ruin the movie. But with regard to this season, they did an awesome job. The set design, as always, is really great, and I love the overall style and the look of the show. The acting, the style, the direction, it all reminds me a lot of like a BBC show, for example, from the British Broadcasting Channel, and basically taking inspirations from other really kind of vintage and successful stories. At times there are even things that kind of feel like out of Fallout, for example, especially with some of the infomercials in season 1, and then some really interesting aspects. You have wacky things like the whole pie room, for example, which is for some reason filled with key lime pie, and just a lot of what we see throughout the course of it. Miss Minutes, the great voice performance by Tara Strong, who has always been great in basically everything I've ever heard her in, and just really did a great job. Not just that, but also they have a lot of scenes, which plays into the time travel element, where where there are a lot of backgrounds for certain characters that are very similar in their different variations or their different placements in the timeline. There are some things that are left a little bit kind of questionable, whether or not, for example, when we see OB and his variant in, the past, I guess you could say, if that is just OB at a previous time. Same thing with Mobius, for example. Definitely not Morbius. It's not Morbin time in this review. And some of the other characters, but they do a really interesting job of showing it visually for the audience. And there are so many Easter eggs that you could point out throughout the course of the show. You just pause it at so many points. You could read the signs. You could tell that they put a lot of effort into the set design, the set decoration, and the overall visual style, which is something I love. Just the cinematography with the point perspective, with the lighting, so much stuff happening in camera on the top of a lot of the visual effects, which are great. Like the scene at the very end of the finale where Loki is literally like he generates his horns and his armor and his classic look, and then he's climbing up the platform that he's creating, I guess out of, time itself, and he's grabbing the different multiversal strands after he destroys the loom, and he's infusing them with his own power, and he wraps himself in them while sitting down on a throne, and then creating Yggdrasil, the world tree from Norse mythology, when he reorganizes everything. In a sense, it's also kind of going back to the concepts of like Tiamat and the dragon from ancient Sumerian ideas and mythology in the Bible, God arranging the chaos into the physical world itself. And so there's a lot of those great elements that they're just telling visually throughout the story. And once again, goes into showing just how excellently handled a lot of the aspects of this season are. And the music is also handled really well in the season as well. There are so many moments where the music really accelerates and emphasizes the emotional beats and aspects at the time. Music is often said to be one of the greatest ways to invoke and evoke emotion in the audience, especially when it comes to film. I know there was a great video I saw years ago where we saw, the end of E.T. without any music, and just, it was kind of awkward. And so the music that was handled by Natalie Holt and the other crew, they did an excellent job with that, and it always made the episodes feel that much better as a result. Another thing I would have to say is the politics are dialed back significantly in this season. Whereas in the first one, you can make arguments about like the casting and about with regard to things like the conversation between Loki and Sylvia on the train and other moments that were then heavily pushed on Twitter and other social media websites. And I'm sure we've seen a million different videos on YouTube for and against them. Fortunately, in this season, there's barely anything like that at all, unless maybe you want to point to like one line that Kang Victor Timely says early on and stuff like that. But either way, the fact of the matter is that seems to have been dialed back. And so, anyone of any political viewpoint, I feel like will enjoy this show because it's not really a factor. It's more about the concepts, the relationships, the dynamics, and all the things that a story should be about rather than the external narrative, which I would definitely have to say is positive. Additionally, I do kind of feel like there were some unresolved plot threads or elements that kind of led nowhere throughout the course of the season, but ultimately most of what we see on screen is implemented in a way that it leads to a mostly satisfying conclusion for the parties involved. Another thing that I wish that they had in this show was post-credit scenes. In the first season they had some, but in season 2 for whatever reason they didn't. Even after the finale, it is Marvel in the MCU after all. You'd expect them to have to try and set up something in the post-credit scene, but instead it just seemed more like what we got in, Endgame, for example, where they just kind of wanted to give the conclusion and that was it. Although I will say that I do really like the credits of this show, and it kind of adds even more to the overall style of it. Now, in terms of the best episode and the worst episode, for me, the best episode definitely has to be the finale, although episodes 4, 5, and 6 are all great in terms of 4 giving you a great cliffhanger, 5 giving you basically its own version of the snap that they did with the spaghettification, I guess is the official term in universe. They even have it on like a a warning sign on the floor at one point going into that room where you could see the loom. And, just basically Loki learning the abilities of time slipping, the Groundhog Day aspect that they had in the final episode. And it keeps going on more and more with regard to that. Amazing finale for the season. And the worst episode I would say would have to be episode 2, Breaking Brad, because the fact is that with regard to that, not only did we get the kind of like in-your-face McDonald's product placement for a lot of that episode, but not just that, but it also felt like we were just kind of wasting time with stuff with Brad. And I know that they kind of wanted to put a face on the variants and, trying to live that life and kind of tie it into somebody who is with the hunters and stuff. But at the same time, I feel like, he barely existed in the first season. And, not just that, but also like, why make a big deal out of his character and give him so much screen time when you could have spent more time on, I don't know, Loki and Sylvie's relationship and things that the audience really cares about and probably wanted to see followed up on more. So overall, with regard to Loki season 2, I think that this show was great overall. Not only season 1, but especially season 2, which in my opinion is definitely far superior to the first season in terms of technical aspects, performances, the story, the concepts, the list goes on. Sure, there are definitely some low points of the season, particularly in episode 2. Maybe you can argue certain points after that, but the fact of the matter is that they did such a great job and showed, especially at this point in Marvel, that they could still do something great. This is such a massive, significant story in terms of setting up what is going to come and also setting up some of the movies we also had. All the multiversal aspects basically are all caused by this show. And so movies like Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, Spider-Man No Way Home, and other movies like that and that are going to come in the future all tie directly into this narrative as well as the main villain moving forward with regard to Kang. And hopefully they won't just like swap him out with Doctor Doom and totally hot shot and fast track everything because of external things going on. But either way, the fact of the matter is that this is a show that made me once again looking forward to seeing what they're going to do in the future of the MCU. With regard to the movies coming out next year, we got Deadpool 3, which is only going to follow up even more in the whole multiversal concept. And in terms of Loki with his character, I know that Tom Hiddleston recently said that he might be done with the character, wants to do other things, but they still left it open in a sense, especially with the idea of variants, that Loki could return. And I'm sure that they will have him come back at some point. I mean, Robert Downey Jr. could come back, Chris Evans. There's a lot of different characters and actors that can come back, and we could just have like a giant multiversal, several different variants per team battling against each other, battling against Kangs, the evil Avengers, the good Avengers, and doing a lot of different concepts that unfortunately DC probably will never get to do on screen because Marvel keeps beating them to the punch on ideas that they basically came up with in the first place. So overall, with all that being said, Loki season 2, in my opinion, is really like peak MCU. Up there with things like Captain America and the Winter Soldier, the movie, not, the TV show, which was mediocre, as I said in my video, you can see in the top right corner, and, Infinity War, things like that. This show is great. And it is something that I hope Marvel's going to learn by example from this. Disney is going to learn by example from this in prioritizing talent and quality over a lot of the other things that they have sunk in the franchise in the past, focusing on instead. But what do you guys think? Let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. Did you like Loki season 2? Do you want there to be a season 3? I don't really expect there to be, but you never really know. I'm sure they could find ways to do it. And not just that, does this give you a little bit more hope moving forward for the future of the MCU, or at least perhaps with regard to certain projects, whereas, something like the Marvels, you could just kind of skip, which is something I did. I didn't even watch Miss Marvel, and I'm disappointed that I watched Captain Marvel all those years ago. But either way, let me know here down below. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, enable all notifications, and stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future, unless I go back in time and make it where it's a different future where there's nothing else to come. But let's just assume that there is. See you later.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.